This is Hannibal here, and before I get into my review of the Bill Watts shoot interview, I just want to say this weekend I will be doing at least one in-person shoot interview with Tony Atlas, who I talked to for about an hour today, and he has a lot to get off his chest. And next week, I am actually going to be in Hawaii, where I will be interviewing none other than Don the Rock Morocco. So I'm really looking forward to that. But let's get into Bill Watts's RF video shoot interview that I obtained the right to air a bunch of clips from. First of all, I first kind of became aware of Bill Watts from this book that he wrote called The Cowboy and the Cross that my parents had picked up sometime around 2005 for $1. It was in some clearance bin at a bookstore here in Canada, and they shipped it to me with a bunch of other stuff when I was living in Puerto Rico. And around that time, I used to read a lot, actually. And at my regular house in Canada, I had a lot of wrestling books. But in Puerto Rico, I didn't end up having a lot of books in the time I was there. So I ended up reading Bill Watts's book probably 4 or 5 times, and I really liked it. I wish I could have worked for him because I think I would have been the type of the Mid-South wrestling style is kind of my style of wrestling, very hard-hitting, realistic style, and the mentality there is my style as well. So I wish I would have got to have worked with him, and although the travel sounds like a nightmare in that territory, the wrestlers made a decent amount of money. I have interviewed Eric Watts myself, Bill Watts' son, who was famously in WCW and also in WWE as part of Techno Team 2000 during the time where they were booking a lot of really lame gimmicks, including TL Hopper, The Goon, Alex Porto, Who, Freddie Joe Floyd, and Techno Team 2000. Which, despite, I think Chad Fortune actually may have, who was Eric Watts' partner, he actually beat Goldberg in a dark match somewhere before Goldberg's streak began. So that's the most famous thing the other member of Techno Team 2000 did. Eric Watts, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go into a bit of detail in this update. My regular internet is still down. So I'm doing this, doing some stream reviews, because people like hearing my opinion of this stuff, but I'll also take your comments. Eric Watts, he's best known for getting a push that a lot of people felt he didn't deserve in WCW. It wasn't that big of a push. I don't think he held any titles in WCW, but he was put over some guys that a lot of people felt he shouldn't have been put over because his body, although it got better in later years, was still developing in his WCW years. Steve Austin apparently refused to job to him one night, which Eric doesn't hold heat with him against. Eric had been a college football player and an amateur wrestler. He tells a story of out wrestling Rick Rude in the dressing room one night. But let's get into this shoot interview. But I was bringing up Eric Watts because I did do an interview with Eric Watts. And when I interviewed Eric Watts, I told Eric that I'd always wanted to interview Bill Watts. And I paid Eric Watts for an interview very well. And I'm pretty sure Bill Watts ended up doing a free shoot interview for someone else, even though Eric Watts told me that Bill Watts may not be up to doing shoot interviews anymore because of his age and health. So if that has changed, Eric, and you see this, I'm still very interested in interviewing Bill Watts myself. But I was saddened when I saw that, considering I had actually paid Eric for an interview, and I'd really always wanted to interview Bill Watts. And I would have paid Bill Watts for the interview. But this interview was interesting to see. WCW was still around during the time it was released. It was in the dying days of WCW. Kevin Nash was booker. He seemed to hold a real grudge against Kevin Nash for not booking Eric in WCW at that time. Eric had been in WCW as an enhancement guy during the NWO era. You can see matches of him, I think, wrestling in jeans and stuff, but mostly doing enhancement work on WCW Saturday night, and his body was better at that time. It's very clear that Bill Watts is like a man's man in this interview. He comes across smart in a lot of ways, but he does definitely come across very abrasive. He's definitely a money guy. I would love to get his opinion of the AEW overspending, being such a money guy that Bill Watts is. He spoke very highly of some people like Mick Foley, of course, Jim Ross, who Bill Watts helped break into the business and kind of gave Jim Ross his first office job. It's funny, when I've interviewed Jake the Snake really hated Bill Watts, and Bill Watts feels the same way. He said if he saw him, he'd spit in his face. The one thing I will say about Bill Watts that I actually found hilarious is he talks about how religious he is throughout this interview, and I guess he mentions that Jesus Christ died for our sins a bunch of times and stuff. But then he says stuff like, if Jake the Snake was in front of me right now, I'd spit in his face. So I mean, that's not something a lot of religious people would say. One of the funny stories about Bill Watts' book, he claims to have ripped a guy's eye out once and ate it. Hello, Mama with attitude. Anyways, I really enjoyed this Bill Watts interview. There's a lot of questions as to was he racist or not. He definitely pushed a lot of black athletes. He definitely got Junkyard Dog over huge in Mid-South. Junkyard Dog was over probably more as much as any black athlete has ever been over during the period of time he was in Mid-South, when all the heels were getting lynched by the fans. He also tried to push Ron Simmons in WCW. That push flopped, and honestly, I remember being a kid, and I don't know what you guys think. You can say it in your comments. Bill's other son, I forget his name, but Bill's other son apparently was great at doing music video packages and stuff, and later worked for some big companies doing music videos. He was working behind the scenes. For Ron Simmons and WCW, it felt like they were force feeding that, and it never really got. It was a flop. His championship reign in WCW, you could say, was a flop. He later got over as a team with Bradshaw and the whole damn gimmick. But I remember the day, I think he beat Barbarian or Vader for the title. And I just remember as a kid thinking, why is Ron Simmons Jim? Just because to me, he didn't like seem like a top guy at that time. And for whatever reason, I guess they tried really hard, but it just never got over as a top guy. I guess The Rock is by far the greatest black wrestling champion of all time. I mean, I saw his Bad Blood thing in Atlanta on the weekend. I saw the YouTube clip. You couldn't even hear his music over how loud the fans were cheering, which is just crazy. Anyways, Bill Watts, controversial guy. Was he racist? He definitely pushed black athletes. Did he used the N-word in this video. Apparently, a lot of people threw around the N-word in the old days. Apparently, it was thrown around a lot. Some people, like Brian Knobs, still throw it around today, unfortunately. Did they say it because it was because they really didn't like Black people, I don't know. It's definitely considered a horrible thing to say now. Um, so I really don't know. I don't know him well enough. I never met him in person to know what his true feelings were. Um, but he definitely supposedly got released over some comments he made that I guess Hank Aaron took offense to, who I'm not going to pretend I know who Hank Aaron is. I think he was involved with baseball, but he did like decrease WCW's losses and almost made WCW profitable. And during that time of WCW, I watched it and I was a fan of it as a kid. For everyone that says it was horrible, I liked it. I definitely liked it. So that was just my opinion of it. Very entertaining interview clips. I hope to interview Bill Watts one day. We definitely got to see the side of his personality. The other things he mentioned, he didn't. The interesting things was he liked Rick Steiner more than Scott Steiner, Sting more than an Ultimate Warrior. I wish they had asked him about the Dick Slater Sting fight in this. That would have been interesting. One thing he mentioned in this, that John Tatum actually killed somebody in a driving under the influence accident while he was in the Mid-South Territory that led to a lawsuit that apparently cost Bill Watts some money. That was something I had never heard before. And the one intro, I do believe that Bill Watts was tough. I do believe that. I've never heard any stories about him getting beat up. It's interesting that I recently saw a clip of Nash saying he wished he had beat Bill Watts up. I'm not saying Nash isn't tough and isn't big. With Bill Watts's amateur wrestling background and football background and dirty fighting tactics like that he always talks about, that would definitely. I don't know if Bill Watts would have been a pushover for Nash. That I wouldn't know really who to pick if they had actually gone at it. Now, of course, Bill Watts, I don't know how old he is, in his 80s. With Nash is what, in his early 60s, late 50s. Nash would obviously have the advantage, but if that had happened when they were both in WCW, I mean, that would have been an interesting fight. I don't know if Nash would have walked over Bill Watts, because Bill Watts definitely has fighting skill, very thick. You can see by the size of his neck. Like, I've fought a lot of people. It's hard to knock down and knock out people with thick necks like the neck that Bill Watts has, and that are skilled. So that would have been interesting to see. You know what? I would rather see Kevin Nash against Bill Watts than Kevin Nash against Logan Paul in a shoot fight between those two fights. Legitimate. Anyways, I'm glad I got to see that. Let me know your thoughts on Bill Watts in the comments. It's too bad. At least Eric Watts got to be in WCW and WWE, which is more than a lot of wrestlers can say. He was under contract in both companies. That's an accomplishment, and he was successful outside of wrestling. I think his daughter is getting into wrestling too. I think I've heard rumblings of that. So the Watts family legacy might not be over. Have a great night.